One of the more arresting images of 19th century art is Vincent van Gogh's self-portrait with bandaged ear, on display at the Courtauld Gallery in London. It was painted in January 1889, shortly after the artist left hospital. He'd had yet another argument with fellow painter Paul Gauguin, whom he'd invited down to the south of France to stay and work at his house in Arles. In a fit of rage, Van Gogh threatened Gauguin with a razor, but then instead turned it on himself, cutting off most of his left ear and nicking an artery in his neck. The damaged ear is seen here on the right because, of course, Van Gogh used a mirror to catch this profoundly miserable moment. The fur hat was new, bought partly to relieve the cold of his underheated room and partly to keep the gauze dressing in place. Aside from his poignant expression, loneliness, frustration, Van Gogh shows us something else. In the background, hung next to the blue door, is a Japanese woodblock print. From existing copies, we know that it depicts courtesans at leisure. In the background, we see Mount Fuji, the great peak which is seen from the city of Tokyo, then known as Edo. The fame, such as it is, of this particular print lies not in its own artistic merit, but rather on its reproduction in Van Gogh's paintings. For far from being his only Japanese print, he actually possessed over 600 of them, most of which are now held by the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. 2 years earlier in Paris, Van Gogh was having no success at all in selling his own work, as we know only too well. And he was clearly hoping to make some money by exhibiting woodblock prints which he'd bought from a well-known dealer in Japanese art. He couldn't afford the most sought-after artists, such as Kitagawa Utamaro and Katsuhiko Hokusai, whom Claude Monet collected in depth. But he did manage to acquire over 40 landscapes by Ando Hiroshige, 2 of which he famously copied. However, the sheets he selected from Samuel Bing's stock turned out not to be the highest quality, and as a result, the exhibition he organised was an utter flop. So he ended up holding on to them, and he came to find solace in them, and also a means to advance his own work. The one artist whom Van Gogh bought in real quantity was Utagawa Kunisada, who was otherwise known as Toyo Kuni III, one of the most commercially successful designers with an enormous output over decades. Indeed, half of Van Gogh's prints were by Kunisada, beautiful women and stage actors. Theatre was a prominent feature of Edo's expansive urban culture, catering to a newly wealthy, upwardly mobile middle class. The theatres were gathered together in Yoshiwara, a district populated with theatres, tea houses and brothels. It was labelled the Yukio, the floating world, a term that referred to the transience of life. And this so-called floating world was a place to be seen and to see, not unlike Paris. Although Japan was socially stratified, as most societies are, the theatre was one place where members of the aristocratic samurai class would freely mix with the upwardly mobile townspeople. All the kabuki actors were male, but they were also specialists. Those who took on the female roles, the onagata, paid minute attention to their wigs, their makeup, their dress, what they carried, and they became style setters in themselves. Unsurprisingly, the nuanced gendering of kabuki performances has now attracted its own scholarly attention. Mixing acting, music and dance, kabuki offered spectacle. Its capacious, balustraded stages were cunningly fitted with all sorts of devices, hidden lifts and revolving platforms, and they joined to runways that ran right out through the audience, facilitating dramatic entrances and exits. Whatever gender or type of role they played, the principal actors were celebrities. Indeed, around 200 years ago, there were even fans, and this is not unlike today, who mimic their idols in a manner that's pretty familiar. The actors had their own adoring fan clubs, and printed images of them were consumed at the time with enormous enthusiasm. They might be shown expressing all the drama of their current roles, or more casually relaxing off stage. The artists and the block carvers responsible for creating these complex prints were part of a huge industry. At the very top end, there were special commissions of luxury prints by celebrated artists which were produced in very small editions. Kunisada, for example, moved among the elite of Edo and was a good friend of Hokusai and on close terms with many of the celebrity actors he depicted. At the bottom end of the market, cheap prints advertising kabuki performances flooded the city. So it wouldn't be at all surprising if such ephemeral material ended up as packing for goods destined for the West. And that's surely how the myth arose that Europeans first encountered the great woodblock artists of Edo in the form of wrapping paper. Over 600 publishers in Edo churned out theatre prints, alongside images of beautiful women, scenes from literature and history, and tales of the supernatural. Van Gogh proclaimed an alliance with these artists, but he was surely unaware of the sheer complexity of the marketplace in Edo, or the number of contributors, or the economic forces driving it. He entertained the fiction that Japan represented a simpler and purer society than France. And he wrote that looking at Japanese art made him much happier and more cheerful. The saturated colours of his recently acquired woodblock prints led him to believe that the intense daylight that he experienced in southern France was actually echoed in Japan. Van Gogh's imagined Japan can be excused, to a degree, since the country had long been closed to foreigners. But that situation changed dramatically in 1853 when it was forced open by an American naval officer, Commodore Matthew Perry. Perry threatened to flatten the city of Edo if the government didn't agree to trade with the United States. And in this, he was emulating attacks on the South Chinese coast by the British just a decade earlier during the First Opium War. But given how sophisticated and commercialized Edo was at that time, it's ironic that Van Gogh should have perceived the country to be a less complex society than France. Because when Perry arrived on the Japanese coast with his naval forces, the population of Edo was over 1 million people, about twice that of Paris. After Perry had forced Japan open, Japanese materials started arriving in Paris in quantity, and the rich colours of woodblock prints initially unnerved collectors who worried that they might not be authentic, leading some Japanese dealers to age the paper, yellowing it with tea, for example. The woodblock prints soon had a profound effect on artists in Paris, who were themselves chipping away at received tradition. Painters in particular were provoked and they were influenced by the print's striking imagery, flat areas of colour, crop compositions, and strong linear rhythms. Van Gogh found this linearity of Japanese prints a wake-up call. He was especially compelled by Hokusai's landscape sheets, which were widely admired both in Japan and in Paris. He couldn't afford the Hokusai prints at Samuel Bing's shop, although he saw them, but he did, however, own one Hokusai book from a 3-volume set which was printed just in black ink. And through that, he had in his hands one version of the celebrated Great Wave, probably the most famous Japanese woodblock print, behind which stood a long tradition of rhythmic mark making in East Asia with its origins in Chinese painting. The rhythmic lines of Van Gogh's later work owe a great deal to Japanese printmakers. But it's more than just the rhythm. In this subtle, uncanny painting at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Van Gogh brilliantly balances the 2- and the 3-dimensional, the flat and the volumetric. Looking through his sanatorium window at rain falling outside, he abstracts the downfall as a pattern of slender lines, a device that he borrows from Utamaro, Hokusai and Hiroshige. Hovering between a particular moment in time and a sense of timelessness, he doesn't allow us, the viewer, to settle for one or the other. Curiously, Van Gogh's collection of Japanese prints shares 2 significant features with the print collection at Drexel University. Both are strongly weighted towards Kunisada, and both served an educational purpose, in Van Gogh's case, of himself. Philadelphia was introduced to Japan, or perhaps better, a mirror of Japan, at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition. This was a massive World's Fair, but what visitors gleaned from the Japanese bazaar at the Centennial Exhibition was skewed, since the arts on display had mostly been made for export and hardly represented the tastes of people in Edo itself. In the last decades of the 19th century, collecting things Japanese now became as much a fashion in America as it was in France, and it was tagged with its French name, Japonism. So what came out of Japan? What was bought in Philadelphia after the Centennial Exhibition bronzes, ceramics, silk. Silk was so much associated with East Asia, with China and Japan. And this kimono, which is decorated with these splendid chrysanthemums in pale buff color and pinks and blues, which have faded over time, was actually bought by a Drexel alumna, Grace Elizabeth Freisinger, and then subsequently donated to the university, where it's now in the Fox Historic Costume Collection. Gives a sense of the craze for the Japanese, for what was perceived to be Japanese culture in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Among the nearly 10 million visitors to the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia was surely James W. Paul Jr., a member of the city's moneyed elite who was shortly to become the son-in-law of Drexel University's founder, the banker Anthony J. Drexel. We almost certainly see him here, standing with his wife Fanny, who's distinguishable by her red hair, and together they're seeing off Fanny's sister on her honeymoon. Shortly before his death in 1908, James Paul donated his collection of Japanese prints to what was then the Drexel Institute of Art, Science and Industry, a fine gift from the board's third president. He surely hoped that these images would be actively used to inspire generations of Drexel's artists and designers. And for 100 years, Drexel students have been able to study the prints of Kunisada as Van Gogh did. It's up to them whether they explore his marvelously invented designs or immerse themselves in the rich 400-year history of kabuki theatre. But the prints are a reminder that from its founding, the visual arts have been an integral part of a Drexel education.